I stayed through her darkest days, supported her through everything, and she repaid me by lying about protection to trap me in a relationship she was already sabotaging. By the time we sat across from each other in that mediation room, she had already lost more than she ever thought she could. I found out she was cheating on me at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, while I was sitting in the waiting room of a co-parenting mediator's office. Not found out in the dramatic sense. I had known for months by that point. But that morning, watching her walk in 15 minutes late, wearing the perfume she only wore when she was trying to impress someone, something finally locked into place for me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done. And I think that scared her more than my anger ever did. Let me back up, because this story doesn't start in a mediator's office. It starts about 4 years earlier, at a birthday party for a mutual friend, where I met a woman named Cassidy and made the best decision of my life. She was funny, that was the first thing. Sharp, quick, the kind of person who could read a room and adjust herself to it instantly. I was 26, and I had just come out of a pretty forgettable 2-year relationship, and Cassidy felt like a different species entirely. She had this energy that made you feel like you were the only person she was talking to, even when you were surrounded by 30 other people. We started dating about 3 weeks after that party. It felt easy at first, really easy. She was affectionate and enthusiastic, and she made me feel like I had finally found somebody worth being with. I was fully in within the first 2 months. I know how that sounds, but at the time it felt right. The first sign that something was off came about 4 months in. Not a dramatic sign, just a quiet one. She started having panic attacks. The first one happened while we were at a grocery store, and I remember how lost I felt watching her try to breathe through it in the cereal aisle. I held her hand and talked her down and drove her home, and afterward she cried and told me she had been dealing with anxiety for years but had never really told anyone. I told her it was okay, that I wasn't going anywhere, and I meant it. What followed was a stretch of time that I can only describe now as me becoming her primary support system without ever agreeing to that role. Her therapist canceled on her repeatedly, and she stopped trying to find a new one. Her friendships drifted away. Some of that was her anxiety, but some of it was her, I came to realize. She had a way of burning through people once they stopped serving a particular function for her. But I stayed. Because I loved her, and because she was struggling, and because I genuinely believed that was what you did for someone you cared about. Looking back, I should have noticed that she never once asked how I was doing during any of that. Not once. I went through a rough patch at work around month 7, got passed over for a promotion I had worked 2 years toward, and when I tried to talk to her about it, she redirected the conversation to her own anxiety within about 4 minutes. I remember sitting on her couch afterward feeling hollowed out, telling myself she was going through a lot and I needed to be patient. I told myself that a lot. We moved in together after about a year. Her suggestion, her timeline, her urgency. She was having trouble paying rent because she had left a job she hated without lining up another one, and she framed moving in together as a natural next step for a serious couple. I agreed because we were serious. In my mind, at least. Living together was when I started seeing the patterns more clearly, even if I still wasn't naming them. She had a way of reframing things. If she made a mistake, it became a story about her growth. If I pointed out something that hurt me, it became evidence of my inability to support her. She never apologized directly. Not once in 4 years. Every apology was a performance of self-reflection that somehow circled back to what she was learning about herself. She started talking about her past relationships a lot, about how controlling her exes had been, about how she had never been allowed to be fully herself. I listened and sympathized. I was different, I told her. I wasn't like that. I don't think I understood at the time that she was laying groundwork. About 18 months in, she brought up the idea of opening the relationship. I want to be honest about my reaction because I don't think it was particularly heroic. I didn't say no immediately. I asked questions. I tried to understand where it was coming from. She had this whole framework for it, talked about how monogamy was a societal construct, how she felt like she had parts of herself she couldn't explore in a closed relationship, how she had been reading about ethical non-monogamy and it resonated with her. I told her I wasn't interested, that I was fully committed to her and I needed the same in return. She said she understood. She kissed me on the forehead and told me it was just a conversation, that she wasn't going anywhere. I believed her. 2 months later, I found out she was already sleeping with someone else. Had been for about 6 weeks. I found out because she left her laptop open and I wasn't snooping. I was literally just going to close it, and there it was. When I confronted her, she cried. She told me she had been scared to bring it up again because of how I had reacted the first time. She said my resistance to the conversation had forced her to act without telling me. She used the word forced. I should have ended it right there. I know that. Everyone I've told this story to knows that. But I was in love with her, and she was sobbing. And she said she needed me and that she was terrified of losing me and that the other guy meant nothing. So I did what I had been trained to do by 18 months of her emotional patterns. I absorbed it. I tried to understand. I told myself we could work through it. We went to couples counseling for about 6 sessions. The therapist, I think, could see exactly what was happening. She kept gently steering the conversation toward accountability, and Cassidy kept steering it back to her childhood, her anxiety, her fear of intimacy. The therapist tried to get Cassidy to acknowledge that what she had done was a betrayal. Cassidy acknowledged it in the way she acknowledged everything, as a data point in her ongoing journey of self-discovery. We stopped going after 6 sessions because Cassidy said the therapist wasn't a good fit. Things were fragile but functional for a while after that. I was watchful. She knew I was watchful and she calibrated herself accordingly. She was attentive and affectionate, and she told me frequently that she was committed to us. I wanted to believe it. The thing about being in love with someone who is good at reading people is that when they decide to make you feel secure, they are very good at it. About 8 months after the counseling ended, she told me she was pregnant. I want to be careful here because this part still makes me angry in a way that is hard to sit with. We had been having a conversation for months about contraception. She had been on the pill when we first got together, and she had come off it about a year in because she said it was affecting her mood. We had talked about what to use instead, and she had told me she was tracking her cycle and that we should use condoms during her fertile window. I trusted her. We had a system. I thought we were both participating in it. When she told me she was pregnant, my first reaction was shock and then a kind of terrified happiness, because I did love her and part of me wanted a family with her eventually, even knowing everything I knew. My second reaction, about 2 days later, came from a question I couldn't stop asking myself. I asked her directly, not accusatorially. I just asked, did we slip up? Because I couldn't remember a time when we hadn't been careful. She got very quiet. Then she said that she had stopped tracking her cycle a few months ago because it was stressful and she had assumed we were fine. I asked if she had told me that. She said she thought she had. I knew she hadn't. I knew with complete certainty that she had not told me, because if she had, I would have insisted we use condoms every time, not just during windows she was tracking. And she knew I would have insisted that, which is why she hadn't told me. I didn't say any of that out loud. I sat with it for 3 days, and then I said it out loud very quietly, very evenly. And she cried and told me I was accusing her of something horrible, and that she was pregnant and terrified, and she needed my support, not my suspicion. So I gave her my support, again. We talked about the future. She wanted to keep the baby. I was scared, but I agreed. We talked about getting engaged. I bought a ring. I proposed. She said yes. We told our families. There were photos. There was celebration. And the whole time, I had this low-level hum of wrongness that I kept refusing to listen to. She miscarried at 11 weeks. It was devastating. I won't try to describe it in detail because it was also private and painful in a way that has nothing to do with how damaged our relationship was. She was destroyed by it. I was destroyed by it. For a while, the grief made everything else quiet. Then she got pregnant again, about 4 months later. This one held. And somewhere in the middle of that pregnancy, while I was working extra hours to save money and reading parenting books and trying to be the partner she needed, she was sleeping with someone from her old job. I didn't know that yet. I found out later. But I'm telling you now because by this point the timeline matters. Our daughter was born healthy. That's all I'll say about that because she deserves privacy in all of this. I loved her the moment I saw her, and that part of the story is uncomplicated. The relationship, on the other hand, was already disintegrating in ways I was too sleep-deprived and overwhelmed to track properly. Cassidy went back to work when the baby was 3 months old. I was working from home at the time, so I became the primary caregiver during the day, which I was fine with. I actually loved it. But Cassidy started staying late regularly. Nights out with coworkers, weekends where she needed alone time to decompress. I kept asking if she was okay. She kept telling me she was fine, that she just needed space. I kept making excuses for her: postpartum adjustment, reentry stress. She was going through a lot. She brought up the open relationship conversation again when our daughter was about 7 months old. This time it was different. This time she had language and frameworks and a whole community of people she had apparently been talking to online about ethical non-monogamy. She told me she had been doing a lot of reading and healing, that she understood herself better now, that she needed the freedom to explore herself fully in order to be the best version of herself for our daughter. I asked her point blank if she was already seeing someone. She said no. I asked her why she was bringing this up now, with a 7-month-old baby, when I was already stretched to my limit. She said that was exactly why, because she had been suppressing her needs to be there for me and the baby, and she couldn't keep doing that. I said suppressing her needs by being a present partner to the father of her child wasn't suppression. It was just being in a committed relationship. She said I was being controlling. That word again, the same word she used about her exes. I filed that away somewhere in my mind, in the drawer I kept opening and then closing again. I said no. I said clearly and calmly that I was not interested in an open relationship, that I had a 7-month-old daughter, that I was engaged to her and intended to marry her, and that if she needed more than what our relationship could offer, then she needed to be honest with me about whether she actually wanted to be with me. She said I was giving her an ultimatum. I said I was asking a direct question. She started crying. The conversation ended. Things went quiet again after that. Tense quiet. The kind where you're both performing normalcy for the sake of the baby and the sake of not having to deal with what's actually happening. And then I found the messages. I wasn't looking. I want to be clear about that because it matters to me, even now. I was using her tablet to look up a pediatrician appointment time because my phone was dead, and I saw a notification slide across the top of the screen. I read it. I wish I could say I looked away. I didn't. It was from a man named Daniel. The message said he missed her and asked when they could see each other again. It was sent at 11:30 on a Wednesday night, 3 hours after she had told me she was going to bed early because she was exhausted. I put the tablet down. I went to the bathroom. I sat on the edge of the tub for a while. Then I came back out, picked up the tablet, and looked at more of the conversation. Not hours of it, maybe 10 minutes, it was enough. It had been going on for at least 4 months, possibly longer. The timestamps I saw went back to when our daughter was barely 3 months old. I put the tablet back on the counter face down and I went to bed. I lay next to her in the dark and I didn't sleep and I didn't say anything. I spent that night making decisions instead of making scenes. The next morning, after she left for work, I called a lawyer. That call changed my entire framework for what I was about to do. The lawyer was patient and thorough, and she explained to me, very clearly, that how I handled the next few weeks would affect co-parenting arrangements for the next 18 years. She told me to document everything calmly and legally. She told me not to do anything dramatic. She told me to think about my daughter first, always. I went home that night, and I told Cassidy I knew about Daniel. She stared at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You went through my messages." "I saw a notification on the tablet," I said. "The same tablet we use to track the baby's feeding schedule." "You had no right. You've been cheating on me since she was 3 months old." "It's not cheating. We had a conversation about this." "You mean the conversation where you asked to open the relationship and I said no?" "And that was controlling. I told you. I've told you for years that I need more than you're willing to give me, and instead of listening, you just kept shutting me down. What was I supposed to do?" That was the moment, that exact line. What was I supposed to do? As if the only logical response to her partner not wanting an open relationship was to secretly sleep with someone else while nursing an infant and planning a wedding. I didn't yell. I had made a decision not to yell. I said, "I'm not going to debate this with you right now. We have a daughter and we need to figure out what comes next for her. The rest of it we can deal with through a process." She looked genuinely surprised. I think she had expected me to fall apart or to forgive her again. That was the pattern. She did something devastating, she cried, I absorbed it, we moved on. I wasn't going to do that anymore. I moved out 2 weeks later. We shared the apartment for 10 days while I found a place, which was one of the more surreal experiences of my life. Sleeping in the same bed, making coffee in the same kitchen, carrying our daughter to daycare together while she looked at me like she was waiting for me to break. I didn't break. During those 10 days, something interesting happened. She shifted. Watching me actually follow through on leaving seemed to destabilize something in her, and she went through a rapid sequence of emotional positions. First, she was angry. Then she was apologetic, really apologetic in a way I had never seen from her before, talking about how she had made terrible mistakes and needed help and wanted to go back to therapy. Then she was angry again. Then she told me she had been talking to Daniel about the future, and that she felt a real connection with him, and that she needed me to understand this wasn't just physical. This was her finally claiming the life she deserved. I remember nodding calmly and saying I hoped it made her happy. That infuriated her more than anything. I moved out. I set up the apartment. I started figuring out my schedule as a single parent, and I found, somewhere in those first few weeks of living alone, something I hadn't felt in years. Clarity. I had been swimming in her emotional weather for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to have my own. I sat in my apartment at night after she had the baby, and I felt things without immediately having to manage her reaction to them. It was strange and quiet, and honestly, a little bit wonderful. Around this time, I found an online forum. It started because I was Googling something at 2 in the morning, something like, "Partner uses your support against you," and I ended up in a thread that could have been written about my own life. Dozens of men describing almost identical patterns, the endless emotional labor, the accusations of control when they set limits, the feeling of being the only adult in the relationship while also somehow being the problem. The way their partners framed every betrayal as a form of self-actualization. I became a regular in those threads for a few months. Not because I wanted to build an identity around being wronged, but because I had spent 4 years being told that my perception of events was distorted, and those conversations helped me trust my own memory again. There was something grounding about reading other men's stories and recognizing the tactics, naming them clearly, seeing them laid out in plain language without anyone crying or deflecting or telling me I was being controlling for noticing. I'm not saying those spaces are perfect. There's a lot of bitterness in them, a lot of men who are clearly still in pain. But at a moment when I was genuinely questioning whether I had caused all of this, they helped me see more clearly. They helped me stop blaming myself for her choices. And then Cassidy and Daniel broke up. I heard about it through a mutual friend about 5 months after I moved out. Apparently, the dynamic that she had described to me as finally claiming the life she deserved had a different texture when it was her primary relationship instead of a secret one. Daniel had his own opinions about things, his own emotional needs, his own limits. He wasn't available to be what she needed him to be on her schedule. She called me after they broke up. She was crying. She said she had made a terrible mistake and that she missed our family and that she was in therapy now and working on herself, and she wanted to know if there was any possibility of trying again. I told her I was glad she was in therapy. I told her sincerely that I hoped she was okay. And I told her that no, there was no possibility of trying again. She got quiet, then she said, "I just need you to know that I know I hurt you." I said, "I know you know. I hope it helps you make better choices going forward." She cried harder. I don't know what she wanted from me in that moment. Maybe for the tears to work the way they always used to. Maybe she just genuinely felt what she was saying and wanted me to receive it. I'm not going to pretend I know her internal life. But I stayed on the phone until she was calmer, because we have a daughter together and I was going to have to co-parent with this woman for the next 18 years. Being decent to her wasn't about forgiveness. It was about practicality. Which brings me back to the mediator's office. We were there because we had been unable to agree on a formal custody arrangement. Not because we were at war exactly, but because every time we tried to nail down specifics, she found a way to make it fluid. She wanted flexibility. She wanted things to stay informal. She kept saying we were adults and we could handle it between us. My lawyer had explained to me, very patiently, why informal arrangements were a bad idea. Because informal arrangements meant nothing was enforceable. Because informal arrangements meant every decision became a negotiation, and I had seen what negotiating with Cassidy looked like when she held the emotional leverage. So I had pushed for mediation. She had agreed reluctantly. She walked in 15 minutes late, like I said. The perfume, the slight defiance in her posture, the way she didn't apologize for the delay to the mediator, just sat down and folded her hands and looked at me like we were about to have a reasonable adult conversation. The mediator was a calm woman in her 50s named Patricia. She had clearly done this 1,000 times. She laid out the ground rules and I watched Cassidy calibrate herself to the room, settling into the version of herself she used for professional situations. Measured, thoughtful, emotionally intelligent seeming. The first hour went reasonably well. We talked through the basics: schedule, holidays, communication protocols. Cassidy was cooperative in the way she was always cooperative when things were going her way. Then we got to the part that I had been waiting for. I had asked my lawyer to include, in my documentation, the matter of how the pregnancy had come about. Specifically, the fact that Cassidy had misrepresented our contraceptive situation. The fact that I had been given the impression that she was tracking her cycle and alerting me to her fertile windows, when in reality she had stopped doing that without telling me. I want to be clear about why I raised this. Not to punish her. Not to make her look bad in front of a mediator. But because the pattern of how decisions got made in our relationship was relevant to how decisions about our daughter were going to get made going forward. Because a person who withholds important information from their partner when it suits them is someone whose co-parenting behavior needs to be structured with clear, documented expectations. When my lawyer's brief summary of this was read into the record, Cassidy's posture changed. She said quietly, "That's not what happened." The mediator asked her to elaborate. And Cassidy did what she always did. She explained. She contextualized. She talked about how overwhelmed she had been at the time and how her mental health had been fragile and how she had thought she had communicated the change and genuinely believed I had understood. She talked about it as something that had happened to her, a miscommunication she had been part of, not something she had chosen. The mediator listened without expression. I had also prepared a timeline. My lawyer had helped me compile it. Not accusatory in tone, just dates, documented facts, a record of how events had unfolded. The first cheating incident, the second pregnancy, the months of overlap between the second pregnancy and her relationship with Daniel. Cassidy looked at the timeline and her composure cracked for just a second. It was the documentation that did it, I think. There's something different about seeing your choices laid out as a sequential record rather than as a story you can narrate. Stories can be reframed. Timelines are harder. She said, "I don't see what any of this has to do with custody." I said, "It has to do with decision-making patterns and communication. That's relevant to how we make decisions together about our daughter." She looked at me with something I can only describe as recognition. Like she was seeing me clearly for maybe the first time. Like she hadn't expected this version of me, the one who had done the work, gathered the documentation, showed up to a mediation session as someone who had a lawyer and a timeline and 4 years of pattern recognition. The session lasted 3 hours. We came out of it with a formal arrangement. Shared legal custody, primary physical residence with me during the week due to my work-from-home flexibility, alternating weekends, defined holiday schedules. Everything Cassidy had wanted to keep informal and fluid was now written down. She signed it. She didn't have much choice. Walking out of that building into the gray afternoon light, I felt something settle in my chest. Not happiness exactly, not victory, just the solidity of things being what they were, named correctly, documented, decided. Cassidy stopped me in the parking lot. She said, "I just want you to know that I loved you. Whatever else happened, that was real." I looked at her for a moment. She seemed genuinely tired. The version of herself she performed for mediators and mutual friends and new men she was trying to impress had slipped a little in the parking lot, and underneath it, she just looked like someone who had made a lot of bad choices and was starting to feel the weight of them. I said, "I know you believe that." She waited to see if I would say more. I didn't. I got in my car and drove to pick up my daughter from daycare. She's 2 now. She has her mother's eyes and my nose, and the most alarming personality for a toddler I have ever encountered. She is stubborn and perceptive, and she finds things funny at completely unpredictable moments. I take her to the park on Saturdays, and she narrates everything she sees in a running stream of half-formed sentences, and I think about how I would have done absolutely anything to be her father, including going through everything I went through to get here. I'm not going to pretend the last year has been easy. It hasn't. Being a primary parent while working full-time while healing from 4 years of emotional distortion is its own kind of exhaustion. There were nights in those first few months when I sat at the kitchen table after she was asleep and felt the kind of grief that doesn't have a clean name because it's not just sadness. It's the mourning of a version of your life that was never actually real. I mourned the version of Cassidy I had fallen in love with. The funny, sharp woman at the birthday party who made me feel like the only person in the room. I don't know how much of her was real and how much was performance. Probably some of both. People are usually some of both. I mourned the family I thought we were going to be. The wedding that didn't happen. The plan I had in my head for what my 30s were supposed to look like. And then, slowly, I stopped mourning it and started building something else. Cassidy is in therapy, as far as I know. She's been more consistent in the co-parenting arrangement than I expected, actually. She shows up on her weekends. She calls when she says she'll call. Whether that's because she genuinely changed something or because she knows I have a documented record and a lawyer on retainer, I can't say. Probably both. She's not with Daniel anymore. She dated someone briefly after him who seemed to last about 4 months. I know this because our daughter mentions people she meets at Mommy's house, and I listen without asking follow-up questions because it's not my business and it's not useful. She mentioned someone new recently. My daughter called him by a nickname. I hope, sincerely, that he is someone who sees what he's getting into. Not because I want her to be alone or miserable, but because I've thought about this. The open relationship she pushed for, the one she told me was about freedom and self-discovery and claiming the life she deserved, turned into a series of relationships that each ended when the novelty wore off and the actual work began. That's not liberation. That's just the same pattern repeating with different people. There's something in that which isn't satisfying in the way revenge is satisfying. It's more like watching someone walk into the same wall in different rooms and knowing you can't do anything about it. I went back to therapy about 6 months after the breakup. My own therapist, chosen by me, attended consistently. Talking to her helped me understand a few things I'm still working through. One of them is that I stayed too long not just because I loved Cassidy, but because I had absorbed the story that staying was what good partners did. That my patience was a virtue and my limits were control. It took a lot of sessions to understand that patience without limits isn't virtue. It's just slow self-erasure. Another thing I worked through was the question of fault. Not in the sense of who's to blame, that's pretty clear and I've been clear about it here, but in the sense of my own choices. I chose to stay after the first cheating incident. I chose to get engaged to someone whose behavior had already told me exactly who she was. I chose to believe, again and again, that this time the conversation would land differently. I'm not beating myself up for those choices. I made them from love, and I made them in good faith, and I was also genuinely manipulated by someone who was skilled at manipulation. Both things are true. But I take responsibility for the part that was mine. I ignored things I shouldn't have ignored. I prioritized being the partner she needed over being honest with myself about what I needed, and I paid for that. For a while, I paid for it pretty heavily. The online community I found after things fell apart helped me name a lot of what had happened. I don't post there much anymore. I dip in occasionally when someone describes something that resonates and I have something useful to say. I try to be one of the voices in those spaces that isn't just bitter, that's actually gotten to the other side of it and can say, it does have an other side. Because it does. I had a first date about 3 months ago. Nothing serious, nobody I've introduced to my daughter, just dinner with someone who seemed interesting and turned out to be exactly as interesting as she seemed. We've been out a few times. It's tentative and I'm cautious in a way I wasn't at 26, but the caution feels healthy rather than fearful. I'm paying attention to different things now. Not just whether someone makes me feel like the only person in the room, but whether they ask how I'm doing and mean it. Whether they take accountability for small things, because how people handle small accountability tells you everything about how they'll handle the big kind. I don't know where that goes. I don't need to know yet. What I know is that I'm okay. That I built a life out of the rubble of what Cassidy and I had, and the life I built is quieter and mine in a way the other one never fully was. My daughter laughed so hard yesterday that she fell down. She was sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor, and she fell over sideways, completely undone by something only she found funny, and she looked up at me from the floor with this expression of pure astonished joy. I don't know what I would trade that moment for. Not one thing. If you're reading this because you're in the middle of something like what I described, the endless accommodation, the redirection, the sense that your own needs keep getting filed under later, while you pour everything into someone who has become expert at receiving without giving, I'll say what I wish someone had said to me earlier. Your perception is not distorted. Your limits are not control. Staying is not automatically the loving choice. And the person who needs you to be smaller in order to feel free was never offering you the partnership you thought you were building. Walk away before they make it a legal matter, if you can. And if you can't, document everything. That's all I've got. Thanks for reading.